All right, so I'm Joan lacqua, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight for tonight's Out of the Archives event with Cristela Guerra and Kate Sosin. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to make a couple of plugs, one generally for the History Project and then one for Trans Day of Remembrance ceremonies this weekend. So first of all, welcome. The History Project, if you haven't come to one of our events before, you aren't familiar with what we do, is Boston's LGBTQ community archives. So we document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history collected about the greater Boston area, which if you're from Massachusetts, you know that really includes New England. If you want to learn more about what we do, and if you want to support our work, please visit our website, historyproject.org. We're on a lot of social media. Our former events are on our YouTube channel, digital collections and collection guides and information on how to donate time, funds, or your own history is all available there. And then, so this week has been Trans Awareness Week, I believe, officially, Transgender Awareness Week, which culminates in Trans Day of Remembrance. In the Boston area, services will be happening this Sunday, virtually, put on by Trans Resistance. And so their Trans Day of Remembrance is a day to memorialize those who have been murdered as a result of transphobia and to celebrate our magical trans, queer, Black and Indigenous people of color community. Their event will be streamed on Zoom, but also on their Facebook page. So I'm going to put that in the chat so that you can join in on Sunday evening with them. And now it is my pleasure to announce our two speakers tonight. Tonight we're joined by Cristela Guerra. Cristela is an arts and culture reporter for the ARTery, which is part of WBUR. She's driven to understand people's passions, committed to local communities, and hopes to use the arts as a lens to delve deeper into stories of equity, culture, social justice, and race. Previously, she worked at the Boston Globe and the Florida News Press. Kate Sosin is the 19th LGBTQ+ reporter focusing on transgender rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy. Kate's conducted deep dive investigations into transgender prison abuse and homicides for NBC News. They previously worked at Logo TV, Into, and Windy City Times. And with that, so these two will have a bit of a discussion and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Yeah, otherwise, thank you both so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us. This is so exciting to get to do this with you all. For those who don't know, the first place that Cristela and I actually met in person and got to start this project was actually at the History Project. So it was really important and critical to our reporting from the very first step when we did this story. So it means a lot to be able to sort of get to be here really on the anniversary of this reporting. Just kind of a year to the day since we started this, right, Cristela?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And the before we really gave it you flew in and we were able to kind of take a full week to do the work in Boston that we needed to do. And the first place that we went was the History Project. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I see Larissa is commenting that Rita lived down the street from you in Allston. Yeah, and that is, yeah, so I want to sort of launch into this story, which is how we ended up doing it. So maybe is that a good place to start there? So Cristela and I started doing this project more than a year ago, and we have been working with, no, Larissa, that was great. Actually, it's really helpful, and I'm excited to talk with you about that. So more than a year ago, I was talking with Eric Jahola, who's actually a documentary filmmaker, about some of the reporting that I had been doing and and some of my interest in reporting trans homicides, and he had mentioned being in Boston and that Rita's murder was unsolved, and I said that that was a big interest to me and that that was something I wanted to look into. And so we talked about doing that, and I said that if I wanted to do that, I really would want to do that with a reporter who was in Boston. And the first person who came to mind was actually Cristela, because we had met the June before on a panel. I just thought Cristela was such a great reporter. And so we started talking about what it would mean, because, you know, year after year, we just report dozens and dozens and dozens of transgender homicides. They're almost always Black transgender women. They're almost never solved, and they're forgotten as quickly as they're reported. We almost always, they're reported so quickly, we almost never hear their actual stories. They're just sort of death counts that scroll by. And it really struck me that Rita's murder, which inspired this international movement of counting and cataloging trans homicide victims, was never even solved. Like this huge international movement, and we couldn't even solve that murder. And so and that's at the point when I called up Cristela, and I'd love you to jump in here, maybe Cristela, and talk about how that fits with the work that you've been doing.
Well, so it was really interesting because we met at the Athenaeum on a panel in the summer over Pride. And so it was a conversation about Pride at the intersection of a lot of issues that were being brought up. I think Pride was being challenged in the way that it represented itself, being too white, cishet, and sort of acting very heteronormative, and in a way, you know, specifically the way that it would sort of not even acknowledge the fact that it was built on the backs of queer, of trans women of color, specifically Black trans women of color, who began the whole movement. So it was interesting that, you know, Kate and I were doing this panel. It was in this really, I'd never been inside the Athenaeum before, and I was just very struck by it and its presence of this private library in the city of Boston. And then I was taken aback, you know, when they wanted to have me be a part of, first of all, what I knew was going to be a very rigorous piece, but beyond that, like, I kind of, you know, fangirled over them, because I was like, you know, this is a story that you should do. Like, I like, investigative wise, my work in journalism had been more, I guess, geared towards human interest stories. I hadn't done all that many investigations, and I also knew what it would look like to delve into the life of someone like this. It was going to take a lot of emotional labor. And I don't know if there was any better person to do it with than with Kate, because we both have the same drive to understand people in a really compassionate way, to understand, like, that even, I think, Kate, you knew that the family would speak to us. I was doubting that. And we knew from the radio side that if the family did speak to us, that our portion would be in talking to them, because for the audio in and of itself would be a remarkable story, because they hadn't really spoken to the press in decades, and I think kind of felt forgotten by the press. But when we began, which was in June of 2018, or when we talked maybe in July of, it was, we met in June, so we talked what, in August of 2018? Was that it? Or 2019?
2019, yeah.
Time is not existing right now. This year, yes. So, but when I felt like I felt I had all these feelings about delving into an investigation that was this comprehensive. I just started my job as a race reporter. I hadn't really covered equity and race to the extent that I thought. I was really like gaslighting myself, and I had a lot of imposter syndrome, that I thought that I could bring anything to this investigation, knowing the way that Kate had done these comprehensive, long form, like beautifully done looks at how trans people are treated in prisons and otherwise. So I wasn't sure what the partnership would look like. I just knew that I wanted to be a part of it. And so Kate knows that I do this, but I attribute the fact that this exists to them, because there was no way that this could have happened if they didn't know that we would be the right team to tackle it. And if they didn't believe firmly that we would get the family to talk to us. Kate, do you want to talk about the documentary portion of this? Because the meta side of this just really makes me laugh.
Yeah, I do. Should we tell? I mean, I think it's important maybe to tell folks a bit about Rita. I'm sure.
How much do folks actually know about Rita Hester, aside from the basics, from the headlines? Not much.
Yeah. So let's. Maybe
We
I
do
want to
that.
get in little.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do that.
Okay, let's talk about Rita first. So Rita Hester was a Black trans woman. Yeah, I think a short history would be cool. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew is an old friend. And so yeah, Rita Hester was a musician. She was a Black trans woman. She was 34 and living in Allston, and she had grown up in Connecticut. She had a family that really loved and supported her, which even today, coming out as a trans woman is a difficult ask, right? It's not always common. And she moved to Boston when she was in her early 20s, I want to say, and did that because she had community there, queer community, and was heavily involved in the rock scene, and went to Jacques a lot, and just was really involved in queer community, had like a really vibrant life in Boston. She was extraordinarily beautiful. People said that she really lit up a room. She was a really positive presence, and she was really beloved in her community, and people described her as just really sweet and vibrant. And on November 28th, 1998, she was very mysteriously and extremely brutally murdered in her apartment in Allston at around 6 p.m. Just like, and her murder was never solved. A couple of neighbors heard a commotion, called the police. They showed up, made a very brief police report, and after that point, it seemed like, the trail kind of quickly went cold. But there was something different about Rita Hester's murder than other murders of trans people that had been reported over the last few years, which is that it followed the murder of Matthew Shepard a few weeks before. And Matthew Shepard, of course, was sort of championed as an LGBTQ cause, and he was young, he was white, he was beautiful. And Rita was young, Black, trans, and beautiful, and largely forgotten. And this really angered a lot of transgender people who raised this as a movement. And so what we saw was a march that happened in Boston from Rita's apartment to, I want to say, was it the Model Cafe or the Silhouette? The history is a little, it's escaping me now.
They marched to the Model, but Rita.
Someone knows this. Larissa, do you know this? I think it's, yeah. So there was a march, and there was a big protest, and the LGBTQ press even misgendered her, which was the other thing that really set folks off. So pretty much all the papers described Rita inaccurately as a man, and this really set off an international movement. By the next year, we saw a movement by LGBTQ activist Nancy Nangeroni and Gwendolyn Ann Smith to cement this day of Transgender Day of Remembrance and honoring our dead, which has grown into this movement of a day every year where we recognize trans people who are victims of anti-trans violence and this list that is created. And so that's who Rita was. And the sad thing about it is Rita actually, outside of Boston, really, and the friends who knew her and the folks who sort of lived on her street, kind of gets lost in that history. her own story sort of gets lost, and we don't talk about her as much, but she really is very instrumental, and her family really very much still has continued to ask for answers in her murder. And so that's the point at which we sort of picked up the story.
It felt like the family was kind of kept in this sort of, I mean, as I guess happens when you lose someone in such a brutal way, like that part of their life was this bubble. It was like a time capsule of sorts. And while you saw the movement for trans rights and LGBTQ rights and marriage and so much was coming, but it felt like the family wasn't really involved in it. And so something that Kate asked that we both wondered about was how they felt, or did they realize what level that Rita had risen up to, that Rita had gotten this sort of, was sort of viewed as now like one of the matriarchs of the movement in some way, simply because her life began Transgender Day of Remembrance. And I'll never forget, we were at TDOR last year, and Kate, you said this was often the first event that most people went to when they were trans, when you were around other trans people. This was when you, I guess in the way that some queer folk would end up maybe at a gay club or wherever you met your first person that made you feel safe. This place where you were honoring other people like you that were no longer on this earth was the first place that many people found other trans folks, you know, and found people fighting for rights and fighting for acknowledgement, fighting for so many different things. So that's where we went first. We were at the History Project doing research, cutting out clippings. We went to TDOR in Boston, and we ended up at Jacques. I think Jacques was the place where we started really making headway. And I don't know, Kate, would you say it was like it didn't feel like a coincidence because Jacques was one of Rita's places, but we went to Silhouette first, and Silhouette wasn't very full that night. But the bartenders remembered Rita. And the bartenders at the Model said that before they remodeled the cafe in Allston, they had a picture of Rita up. So there were memories, like there were these gems that we'd find at different locations. And then we stumbled upon Jacques, and there were like 4 regulars there who knew Rita. And we were there for hours just talking about who she was, how she performed, and what they could tell us, knowing that our ultimate goal was to talk to her family, because I especially felt that there was a gap, you know, like every time that someone would rewrite the story about Rita Hester, they would always say the same things, but the family was never really brought into it.
Yeah, and I think we always had this question throughout about, you know, when I've reported a lot of trans homicides, and you'll often find that the perception of a family can be super different from their chosen family, right? And so, you know, I am a trans person myself, and I think of my family, and I'm really close to my family, but I think of my own, you know, family were to describe me, it would be pretty close to, you know, how my friends would describe me. But would it be exactly the same? Like, probably not. I think, you know, your life in person is different when you live in a different city and you're far away. And so, you know, even if Rita was incredibly close to her family, which it sounded like she was, you know, I think we still had a lot of questions, you know, best case scenario, how much did her family know? And so it felt like we were piecing together this person's life. And so as we sort of got to do that, the key piece was, I think for me, the moment that Diana finally called me back. And Diana, of course, is Rita's sister. And what's really difficult about this is it's been so long, and I feel like there's a painful place where we put a lot of things that are difficult, and it's hard to remember. And the more we dig into it and talk about it, those things start to come out. And one thing that Cristela and I discovered in these conversations was that there were a number of people who different people in Rita's life were worried about or concerned about at the time of her murder, or had suspicions about, that we never read about in the newspapers. And those were little threads that we could start pulling, and we've started to pull those threads. And that's where the story got really interesting. And so, for example, someone at Jacques said, well, like Rita had a boyfriend. And we were like, oh, she had a who? And then we're like, well, yeah, she had a boyfriend. And then, we talked to Diana, and Diana said, oh yeah, and there was some friend she had that lived down the street who had a brother, and I don't think the brother liked trans people. And we were like, and so we were always worried about that, and we always wanted answers to that. And so it just we started to ask lots of questions about who are these people, right, in Rita's life. And it started to get really interesting, tracking down and really trying to find these missing pieces, and going back over to people, and going back to Diana, and going back to people at Jacques, and retracing our steps, and trying to find, and that's kind of where we are now, is still doing that work. I still get updates from Diana. And I'd love for Cristela to build off of some of this.
Well, so so again, like, especially journalistically, you never know. Oh, my video spotlighted. That's so weird. You never really know what's gonna get you somewhere. So you have to talk to everybody, and you also have to have a healthy dose of skepticism, because it's been such a long time. You don't really know who's telling the truth. Not to say people are being maliciously lying, but they don't remember things. I don't think I'd ever worked on a case that was so actively, even the cold cases that I worked on when I covered news, there was often a detective actively working on the case. This felt like so many people just kind of set it aside. And what the family kept saying was because of who Rita was, and I think people wanted to make her life into a sob story. They wanted to sort of say that she was at times it felt like, that she was just thrown away. But then, when we spoke to her family, they were so passionately still in love with this person. And there was when Kate got the call back, I remember us celebrating and still wondering how much they would open up their doors, because journalism 101 tells you, well, let's see how far you can get. Let's see if you're lucky. Let's see if they'll let you in their house. And we wanted to talk to Rita's mom, but Rita's mom is older now. And we didn't want to trigger anybody. We didn't want to make people feel, we wanted to only go as comfortable as they wanted to, but we knew we needed to go deep if we wanted to tell the story in a different way. So when we walked into that house, when they allowed us to come visit, which was in early January, so imagine we had done a week or so of reporting, week and a half of reporting at the end of November for Tidor events. We went to Jacques, we went to the Silhouette, we went to the Model, and then Christmas came, and then things kind of dragged, and we weren't sure how far we'd get. With some sources, Kate is contacting people on Facebook. Kate is reaching out to friends that said they knew Rita, and like names that we weren't sure we'd be able to find. We're using LexisNexis. And then two things happened. We could go to meet. It was two things in a row, actually, but it was like 2 months. Rita's nephew decided to meet us at the place that Rita was murdered. And Rita's sister said we could meet at their home. And I was there in person for both of those. And Kate was there via FaceTime because they were in LA. So I spent basically a morning with Rita's nephew, who was the only other openly gay person in Rita's family. He grew up basically seeing, it was very, oh, Kate can talk to this too, like it was very complicated because at times he would say Uncle Rita. At times, her nephew would call her, they would misgender her. There were times where he would reminisce about Rita and dead name her. And it was really hard because you could tell how much he loves her and how much he looks up to her, but it felt like he looked up to the image of what he thought he needed to be as a gay man. Because he saw Rita in transition as well. So he knew Rita prior to her transition. The family would only ever call Rita by male pronouns. And it's, you know, in 2019, it was really hard because it felt very violent, you know, to Rita's memory in some ways. But there was no question for me when I was walking through these streets with her nephew. Her nephew was there at the house the day after Rita died. Her nephew was there at the morgue and identified Rita's body. So it was a lot of emotional labor. We would be in the car and I would ask him if he was okay, if he wanted to stop. You know, like after almost 20 years in journalism, you just know that like you're very lucky if somebody opens up to you this much. And then beyond that, audio wise, like I remember just standing with him outside of the house where it happened and he wanted to go in. And I was like, I'm not sure if we can, but beyond that, do you want to go in there? Like, do you really want to go back in that place? And at times the most powerful sound was silence because he just sort of stood there and remembered both the beauty and like Rita's snakes and remembering when he would spend the night and she would have people over, men over, you know, like there were just so many memories. He was 8 years old, you know, and she called him Ragamuffin. And I'd like to think Rita knew even then that he was going to end up being gay. I think Rita maybe saw in him so much because she would tell him, you're going to come live with me. You're going to come to Boston. You're going to live with me. And Rita was supposed to be that mentor. And she was supposed to be so much to him. And then she was gone. And he had to figure it out by himself and come out of the closet on his own. And he said that he believes that she would have really like provided a context for something for him that he ended up not having. It was very hard. It was very emotional. And I think the hardest was the moments where, so that was one interview in December to put you on the right timeline. And then we did the interview with Rita's mother, sister, and nephew. And there were things, they brought out pictures. They said they had pieces of Rita's clothes in the house. There was a gargoyle that Rita had that guarded her apartment that was now guarding her mother's apartment. It all just felt very much like no time had passed. And it was really infuriating to know that nothing had really changed in the way that trans women were killed. And that year, you know, Kate was reporting actively on other deaths, and we were also reporting this one. And I'll add one more thing and then I'll let Kate take it, but I've never seen anybody more doggedly pursue Boston Police Department and like, just like, you know, in the most polite way, basically say like, you need to give us information about this. And you need to prove that you actually give a fuck, you know, because like all their behaviors sort of were like, there's nothing here to dig. And there's always more to dig. On a case like this, there's always more. I mean, yeah, it was really very frustrating. You know, and I guess in theory, journalism, you always have a sort of like contentious relationship with institutions and law enforcement in general, but like, it was hard because we wanted them to just tell us something.
I mean, it was what, 3-4 FOIAs?
At least.
And then
freedom of information request.
But the beautiful thing about this, which I don't know that is out there. So we started this, I was at Logo TV when I started this, and then got laid off from Logo in April. And so I had to take the story somewhere else. So I'd done all this work, Logo had paid for it, and then I lost my job. And so I pitched it to NBC Out, where I had done a lot of freelance work before, and NBC was happy to take it. And then when I went back to Boston Police and I said, NBC, they were like, okay, we'll send you the police report. They changed tunes. And that's always the case, like with a FOIA request. And it just makes me angry, because I'm like, if you were a regular person submitting a FOIA, yeah. So the articles, yes, we have, we did publish the first installment of articles, but we're continuing to investigate it. And that reminds me of what Cristela wanted to bring up, which was that the other piece of this is that documentary filmmaker that I talked about at the beginning actually followed us throughout this whole process. So starting in October, when I started looking into this, and Cristela started looking into this, Eric Jahola, who's a documentary filmmaker, and his company, he's done some stuff that's been on Netflix and PBS, started following us, starting with the first calls that we made, the first calls to each other, and the first time that we actually met in person, after the first time that we met in person to work on this project. Eric documented and has been documenting that entire thing. And so we were not just reporting on this, we actually had like these cameras over our shoulder, which was like something I was not used to, and like kind of I love Eric, but like I hate, because like, you're trying to do something that's really sensitive and sad and awkward, and then there's like this giant like camera that's there, or you like walk into the Silhouette, which if you've never been there, it's just like a little corner bar, and it's like quiet, and there's just like one person and like a little popcorn machine and no one, and an evening, and here comes like Cristela and I just wanted to talk to someone, and there's like a giant camera behind us. Like, not cool at all. So it presented some challenges to just like getting the to making it normal, but we figured it out. And so yeah, this story will be ongoing for it. I would say as long as it takes to figure out what happened to Rita. And Eric is faithfully following that as well. There was one point where we definitely ran away from Eric and ditched him, just to unload on what happened. But
I feel like neither of us got into television reporting, right? Like I have very dear friends who wanted to be broadcast journalists. I never wanted to be on TV. So it felt very meta to be reporting on one of the most difficult stories I think I've ever reported on emotionally, and then having somebody look to see how I was responding emotionally to this really emotional thing, and to want to process right after things would happen. But from a documentary standpoint, from a journalistic standpoint, we were their subjects. And Rita
yeah,
was
they were like, how'd you feel? And I was like,
bad. Really
they're
bad.
like, are you tired? And I'm like, what do you think? I'm laying on the floor at WBUR. Like, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But it was, yeah. So I think the takeaway from this, I mean, things that we found that were not previously reported. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, we can take turns if you want to. Yeah, you start.
Okay. So, I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit. So I mentioned this before, but Rita had a boyfriend named Bobby, who it seemed like after Rita passed away, no one ever heard from again. And we've been unable to locate mysterious Bobby. And the night, it seemed like the day before she was murdered, she met two guys at the Silhouette. They were described as Australian guys. And, you know, her good friend who met them with her didn't really like them. They seemed uncomfortable to her. So we found that, and then and so that seemed kind of significant. And the other thing that we learned that that felt rather significant was that we put together a timeline of her day, her last day, and that was something that Diana and her family didn't have before. And so they were able to sort of reconstruct the scenarios in which you know, Diana or Rita you know, moved about, and police had not given them that information. So that was the information that we felt like was new at the time. And since then, Diana actually found an ID while moving of another ex-boyfriend that Rita was dating more recently, and who she hadn't heard from, and she sent that to me, and we're tracking that person down. So the reporting continues, the work continues, and this is for sure not over.
I enjoyed like the way, specifically the way that because of friends Kate found on Facebook, who and then friends of friends, who in some case I met up with Brenda at Jacques in person, which I was late for, which was very bad. But we did an interview, and there was so much richness, you know, like the fact that Rita loved figure skating, you know, or that they would go to the bar together, but that Rita never mind going by herself, you know, or talking to, it was Melinda, I think, at Jacques, who was I think still says she's the oldest drag queen, the oldest performer, trans woman, but for at the time, like, I think she said she got there in the 70s, knew Rita and told Rita, don't you hang out with those straight boys. Like, don't hang out at the straight clubs. Those white boys are going to do you harm. Like,
yeah, she worried about Rita for.
And she said they were all her babies because she was the oldest. And she said she'd been through it. She knew a thing or two. And Rita was beloved by everybody. And she passed in ways that maybe other women couldn't. And Melinda remembered her just so distinctly, you know, like so distinctly. I apologize. I'm talking from El Paso, where I've been on vacation, and so forgive like background noises. But yeah, I think it was just sort of like looking at this very bare bones Boston Police Department report, and then all of a sudden getting so much more detail, getting so much more information, simply from like maybe doing work that who knows if they had done or not. I know that the family told us that after a few years, they stopped hearing from the police. And they stopped reaching out because they didn't think that they would get anything else. Do you all want to take questions? Is there any interest in that? So we can engage a little if there are questions that anybody has.
And if folks want to use the hand raise thing, if they want to ask a question out loud, we can make sure that you can get unmuted. I was curious, I'm sure people are typing, about, oh, Jessica has a question. So you're still muted, Jessica.
Yeah, it does. I was just curious how much time you're spending on this now of your time. And you sound like you have a few things you're tracking down specifically that you mentioned. And I suspect there are probably more that are a little on the edge. But is it like half your time or is it significant? I mean, it sounds like a thing that moves slowly. So either of you.
Yeah. So I haven't spent a lot of time on this lately, to be totally honest, mostly because I'm a political reporter now. I work at the 19th and I just got off of election duty, but I'm excited because things are finally slowing down and I can dive back into this. So yeah, I usually try to devote a few hours of this to this a week and just chip away at it. Yeah, and that's the plan, is just to keep working at it. Sometimes I do it in fits and starts and just like go all into it and jump back out. I don't know if Cristela, you wanna.
Yeah, not as much as I would like, to be honest. It's been a hard year. I've been so I was working two beats. I was working arts and culture, and then I was assisting with education because of the issues of COVID. And then earlier in the year, I was covering coronavirus. But then also, we wanted to finish. There was talk of trying to finish our story at BUR on Rita with Kate's for Pride. But our department, the ARTery specifically, always emphasizes um, the kind of coverage that I think mainstream media doesn't always do. And we don't want to only be doing these stories at certain times of the year. So I think we ended up, when we ran it, we were trying to get it for June. It ran in July. And then since then, I haven't been able to make much headway, in part because of the protests and being a race and equity reporter, sort of switching gears specifically into what was breaking. And then the election. So I think that it's something that we're always going to be like keeping tabs on, because I do remember the moment where I believed Kate when they said that we were going to solve it. And at the same time, I remember telling my mother about this story and being really affected by it, and having her be really scared, because depending on how much progress we make, you know, people start hearing about you doing this work, and she's like, they haven't caught who did this. But we did hear from people in the neighborhood that those people were handled. And that was something that people also said. Whatever that means, I guess. I don't know if we'll ever really know. But there's a lot of talk like that, because the neighborhood and the community was so close. Whether or not it was someone that was that close to Rita, I'm not sure. But long story short, I'd like to make sure that we keep tabs on this. I'd like for us to continue the work, and I do think that we could solve it.
So Larissa has a question. Larissa, thank you for your comments in the chat too. It's been really helpful, the links you've been sharing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt too much. I'm kind of in the old biddy grandma mode here, because I saw all of this go down. But the late 90s were kind of, I had first transitioned in Boston, and I still live in Rita's neighborhood. So this was kind of the year of living dangerously, because we'll still have a newspaper called the Boston Herald, which was constantly disparagingly covering and misgendering and dead naming. But I remember the wake at the Model very, very specifically. This was the first time I met Rita's family, and just the emotions outpouring were just so intense. And it still drives me a little batty that is there always going to be pushback on the investigation of this? This is a cold case. And it drives me kind of nuts that, I'm constantly still in her neighborhood to pick up my more hormones, So I guess in your interactions, Kate specifically, did the BPD just pretty much poo-poo any forward thinking on this?
It's really interesting that you asked. They actually refused to provide any information at all, stating that this was an ongoing open case. And I was like, there's no indication that that is actually factually true. I said, there's been no, you haven't updated the family in at least like a decade. There's been no progress that's been announced to the community. And largely the community feels forgotten. In what way is this an open case? And they're, well, we have people, you may not think, but we have people, and they do continue to investigate these. And I was like, okay, then, tell me what that looks like. What's being investigated? And I asked specifically about details, and they're like, well, if you have details to report, then you can turn them over. And I'm like, nope, I want to know, right? And so we went through this over and over, and we did this. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I contacted Boston police over the course of that year, and was like, I'm going to report that you have not, and just FOIA'd. And finally, at the end, the one thing I was able to obtain was the initial police report, which is a single page. It tells us very little. And that's all I've been able to get from them. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm a reporter, right? Like I just reflect what's out there. I think the demand from the community would need to be so great to force that issue. But it does feel like there is a significant amount of detail that we never learned, that I don't know if police ever looked into, and that was new information to Rita's family that we continue to find.
20 years later, there doesn't seem to have been much traction. And I've had interactions with BPD on my own, and it's apathy at best. But there had been trans murders such as Chanel Pickett and Deb Forte, and it became I mean, this current past year has had, I think, the most trans women of color murders in the US alone than any previous reported year. I posted the link earlier for global statistics. But yeah, it's just, it just bugs me out.
Yeah, I think it's this year we've had 37 trans homicides. We have a month left to go. The previous record was 2017, the entire year with 31. It's the deadliest year for trans people ever recorded. So yeah.
Well, thank you for taking my question.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from Anderson Clark. Would you please talk about the length of time that passed between when the police arrived and when the ambulance was called? I remember, Kate, there was her nephew specifically, Tawfiq, was really frustrated by what he heard occurred with that. Do you want me to take that?
Yeah. Well, you should talk about that. I'm going to actually pull up the original story here, because I don't know if I know the amount of time. Wait, off the top of, I'm going to pull up the story. You should talk about it.
Let's do that. I mean, essentially what we're understanding is that they waited, that they didn't bash down the door. They didn't, I think the question that people ask is if they had gone into the place sooner, if they had gotten Rita out of the house, out of her home sooner, if she had gotten to the hospital sooner, could they have saved her life? But they waited. They didn't go in right away.
Okay, so yeah, so this is what I have from the police report. Okay, officers responded to a call at 6:12 p.m. And they were dispatched 7 minutes later. When they found Hester, she was still alive. and more than an hour passed between the time when police were dispatched and an ambulance actually took her to the hospital. I did not include this actually in the article because it ended up just not being totally quotable, but I remember specifically that I talked to an ER doctor, a trans ER doctor, and I was like, is that normal? Like, is that a thing that happens? And he was like, no, there's like, you pretty much get someone to the hospital right away. Like, that's your goal, is to get someone to the hospital right away. It's really unusual that you wouldn't transport. So either you have an issue of entry right into the building, or there something else is going on. So it's exceedingly unusual. Your goal is to safely transport, because whatever you can do in the field is not going to be that good, especially with a serious injury like that. There might be cases where it's difficult to get someone, but an hour is kind of a stretch. So
I think one of the things I'm proudest of with this project is the fact that although we both reported and had a lot of the same information, the two stories complemented each other in such a beautiful way. We had the really robust investigative piece as the main bar, journalistically, as we would refer to as, and then you had my piece focusing in on the family, with some data in each that was the same, but generally both stories distinguish themselves and link back to each other. And then I did a radio story where you were able to hear the family, and that was really hard, and really powerful, because their voices had been erased from this whole conversation for such a long time. And they were able to talk to the life that Rita wanted to have and hoped to have. She was planning for a future and the life that she wanted. She loved going to Greece. She had so many details about her. I think you couldn't help but imagine the kind of life she would have lived, and the life that her nephew would have had if she had survived. So I just was really it's one of those stories that sticks with you and just stays. The character just stays. Especially when you look at her pictures. I feel like I would look at her pictures as I wrote. And I was grateful to be able to, partner with Kate on this. I don't think it would have been the same otherwise.
Are there any other questions?
As folks are thinking about maybe a final question, I'm going to plug again the Trans Day of Remembrance event put on by Trans Resistance in Boston is happening on Sunday. They are streaming it, so there's a link to the Facebook and their website. I think it's transresistancema.com. Jessica, I think you have final comment.
Yeah, I've been reading the articles, and I know there's this feeling that the family loved her, but they referred to her with male pronouns. And I think I can understand that really well, because that's my situation, that they don't always do that, but sometimes they do. And I think it's a lot of how long the family knew her as which gender. And they'll get my family gets my name right, but whenever they talk about the past, they'll use the wrong gender. Yeah. And they'll sometimes apologize, but it's tricky which gender to use. I worked with a historian about some things I did before that he was writing up, and how does it work? Because that's not who I was then. So it's a tricky situation, but I think that's about the family, and that's how a family can love somebody and use the wrong pronouns. It's a matter of how their memories of a person are, as much as how they perceive them in the present or with their last present. And it's pretty, I mean, I just see this all the time, and I've seen it with other people too, but it can be with love, but with, so it's not really, I'm just saying it's not a contradiction. It's a thing you have to deal with if you're trans, but it's not really a contradiction. It's just a complexity, let's say.
I really appreciate that, Jessica. We actually struggled so much with that in the way that these stories would be reported. I think particularly Cristela with the audio, because it's no longer really acceptable to dead name trans people in stories, and yet almost all the audio that we had you know, some form of misgendering and how to use authentic audio, but also, you know, for trans people who are going to hear that, how would that sit and how would that rest and how would that be okay? And also, I wanted to include that piece in my written story and let people know kind of what you were saying, which is that, you know, Rita died at a time before, you know, pronouns and names really were the barometer of trans acceptance, right? And that memory just didn't necessarily transition for them in the same way that it would for us now, 22 years later, right? So when Rita's mother is mourning her and talking about her, she's talking about Rita even back then, but you know, you might hear a male pronoun and it doesn't mean that they're not embracing Rita as who she is. And so we spent so long really agonizing over how to convey that. And so I really appreciate that comment. I think that's a beautiful way to put that.
So we are right at 7:59, and usually we try to get people out of here at 8 so that you can go on, you two are in different time zones. So you can go on and have dinner. The rest of us will go on and have a nightcap because it's late here, alcoholic or not. But I just want to say thank you both so much for talking with us tonight and talking about the work that you're doing. And thank you for the work that you're doing. It's very important and vital, and I'm just like, I'm in awe. And so, yeah, thank you both so much. Thank you for everyone in our Zoom audience tonight for your questions and your comments and your recollections. It's been really emotional, actually. Usually we try to end with a little bit of, you know, moment of Zen, but like, this was just really, it was a special Zoom event, and thank you for being here with us for it. Again, if you are new to the History Project, please follow us. We try to do digital events in these COVID times a couple times a month. We're taking off. Next week is Thanksgiving, I think. We're going to do something in December, and then we'll be back in force in January with some more digital events. So yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you both. Thank you, Kate and Cristela.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We will see you in the archives when we're allowed to be in the archives again.
Oh my gosh. Yes, please. All right. Bye.
Good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.